The soft hum of machines filled the otherwise quiet room, creating a rhythm that was almost soothing. Clara had spent the last few weeks in this sterile hospital room, tending to Mr. Harold Williams, the millionaire whose fame had long outlived his own life. Or at least, that's what it had seemed like. Once an untouchable business mogul, Harold had built an empire only to be reduced to this, lying motionless in a bed, the very man who once seemed larger than life and now confined to the fragility of a coma. Clara had seen her fair share of comatose patients, but something about Harold was different. Perhaps it was the sheer wealth and power he had once wielded. Or maybe it was the haunting mystery surrounding his accident. No one truly knew the details of how he ended up here. Some whispered it was a car accident, others suggested foul play. But no one could say for certain. Now, his body lay silent and still, as if time itself had frozen, while his family, distant and detached, left his care to people like Clara. The room itself was rather unremarkable. Just a typical hospital setting, white walls, pale curtains, the smell of antiseptic always lingering in the air. And then there was Harold, his face pale, his breathing shallow, his eyes closed for so long that they almost seemed like glass, lifeless. Clara adjusted his blankets for the umpteenth time, her movements practiced but almost robotic. She had been doing this day in and day out, changing his sheets, checking his vitals, feeding him through a tube when necessary. But tonight felt different. Clara had been standing by his side for hours, quietly observing the slow rhythm of his pulse as the machines beeped in regular intervals. The clock on the wall ticked away, reminding her of the endless time she had spent in this room. She felt the familiar weight of fatigue pressing down on her shoulders, but tonight, there was a sense of unease she couldn't shake. It was a feeling that crept into the room like a cold draft, unnoticed at first, but impossible to ignore once it had settled in. Suddenly, the heart monitor attached to Harold's chest emitted a sharp, frantic beep, breaking the calm silence that had enveloped the room. Clara jumped, her pulse quickening. She rushed to his side, checking the readouts on the nearby machine. She was certain it was a mistake. Maybe it was a glitch in the system, maybe the wires were loose, anything but what it seemed. His pulse had spiked. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she bent closer, her fingers trembling as she pressed the call button for the doctor. But just as she did, something unexpected happened. Harold's fingers twitched. Then, his hand slowly moved, as if struggling to break free from some invisible restraint. Clara gasped, a jolt of adrenaline coursing through her veins. This had never happened before. She had been told, countless times, that comatose patients, even those in the deepest of states, rarely showed signs of recovery. And yet, here Harold was, showing movement for the first time in weeks. The beeping on the machine grew louder, more insistent. Clara stepped back in alarm, uncertain of what was happening. Could he be waking up? Could it be? Then, just as quickly as the flurry of activity had started, it ceased. The beeping slowed. Harold's hand fell limp again, and his eyes remained shut. Clara hesitated, her breath shallow as she tried to steady herself. What had just happened? She had seen this before, patients sometimes moved in response to external stimuli, but this was different. The change had been subtle but unmistakable. This wasn't a simple reflex. There was intention behind it, as though he had been waiting for the right moment to wake. A few minutes passed in eerie silence. Clara's hand hovered over the phone, ready to call for help, but she hesitated. She needed to be certain. She needed to know if this was real. She leaned over the bed, her face just inches from Harold's. And that's when it happened. His eyes opened. Slowly at first, as though unsure of what he was seeing. Then, they focused, piercing, sharp, and full of something that unsettled her. His pupils darted around the room as if taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. Clara froze. Her heartbeat seemed to slow, each beat louder than the last. She didn't know what to say, how to react. She had never been prepared for this moment. Nurses were trained for everything, procedures, techniques, protocols, but no one had ever warned her about this. The confusion in Harold's eyes shifted into something else. Recognition. And then, in a voice so low and hoarse that it almost broke her, he whispered, "Where am I?" The question hung in the air. Clara's heart skipped a beat, her mouth dry. "You're in the hospital, Mr. Williams. You've been in a coma," she explained, her voice trembling despite herself. But Harold didn't seem to hear her. His eyes continued to search the room, and for a moment, it seemed like he was trying to piece together the fragments of a memory that wouldn't quite come together. His breathing grew more labored, as though the effort of focusing was overwhelming him. Then, just as she thought she might finally get through to him, Harold's gaze shifted to her. His eyes locked onto hers, intense and unnerving. For a moment, Clara felt as if the world around her had ceased to exist. Everything was still. The machines, the room, even the air between them, it all held its breath. "You know what I did, don't you?" Harold said, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes burning with an intensity that sent a chill down Clara's spine. The question hit her like a punch to the gut. Clara blinked, unsure of what he meant. What did he mean by "what I did"? And why had he asked her? She was just a nurse. She had no knowledge of his life before the coma, no insight into the man behind the headlines. Clara swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice coming out shaky. Harold's lips parted slightly, but he didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked past her, his gaze drifting toward the window, as though he were lost in thought. The room was heavy with his silence, and Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss, that this moment was the beginning of something far bigger than she could have ever anticipated. His eyes flicked back to hers. "You know," he repeated, his voice lower this time, more urgent. "You must know." Clara stood frozen, the question echoing in her mind, unanswered. She had no idea what he was referring to, but it was clear that Harold Williams wasn't just another patient. There was something darker, something more complex, buried deep within him. And somehow, she had become part of it. But before she could speak again, Harold's eyes fluttered shut, his body going limp once more. The heart monitor beeped steadily again, returning to its regular rhythm. Clara felt her knees weaken. She took a step back, unsure whether to call for the doctor or to just leave the room. She glanced at the clock. It had only been a few minutes since he had woken. But those few minutes felt like a lifetime. She didn't understand what had just happened. What had he meant? What was this mysterious thing he believed she knew? The questions were too many, too overwhelming. But Clara felt a sense of foreboding deep in her gut. Harold Williams had woken up, and the secrets he carried with him would soon come to light. And that would change everything. Clara had never been one for surprises. In her line of work, she had learned early on to keep a cool head, no matter the situation. It was a skill, one she had honed over years of dealing with patients in critical conditions, of comforting families in moments of crisis, of facing the harshest of realities head-on. But nothing had prepared her for what happened that night. The words Harold Williams had whispered still rang in her ears. "You know what I did, don't you?" It was a question laced with more than just curiosity. It carried a weight, an unspoken challenge that Clara couldn't ignore. She couldn't simply brush it off as a product of the confusion and fog that often accompanied the awakening of coma patients. There was something in the way he had looked at her, intense, demanding, as though he knew she held the key to something long buried, something dark. For the rest of that night, Clara couldn't focus. Every time she checked Harold's vitals, her mind wandered back to those words. She knew it wasn't just her imagination running wild. There was something real there, something Harold had kept hidden all this time. And somehow, he thought she knew. The next morning, when the doctors arrived, Clara was still grappling with the situation. Dr. Miller, the head physician, was the first to speak. When he saw Harold's vitals had returned to normal. "Well, this is something," Dr. Miller remarked with a faint smile, trying to mask his disbelief. "It's a miracle. After weeks in that coma, we didn't expect a recovery, at least not this soon." Clara nodded, trying her best to seem detached. "He's awake now," she said quietly, unable to suppress the lingering unease in her voice. Dr. Miller didn't seem to notice. "He's stable for now. Let's keep him monitored for the next 24 hours. I'll order a full set of tests to see how his brain function is responding." Clara felt a tight knot form in her stomach. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. There was a sense of urgency in her that hadn't been there before. The mystery behind Harold's awakening was not just about his health, it was about the secrets he was hiding. And she needed to know what those secrets were. As the doctor went about his rounds, Clara lingered by Harold's bed, watching him closely. His face was still pale, the lines of age etched deeply into his skin, but there was something about the way he lay there now. He was different. More alive. More aware. The soft beeping of the machines was the only thing breaking the silence. Clara hesitated for a moment before she reached out and gently touched Harold's hand. His fingers twitched slightly in response, and she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe there was a way to reach him, to get answers to the questions that were gnawing at her. "Mr. Williams?" Clara asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can you hear me?" For a long moment, Harold didn't respond. Clara's breath hitched in anticipation, but then, just as she was about to pull her hand away, Harold's eyes fluttered open again. This time, they were clear. No confusion. No fog. "You're awake," Clara said, her voice shaky but filled with relief. Harold turned his head slightly, his gaze locking onto hers. His eyes seemed to pierce through her, searching her as if trying to decipher something. The intensity in them sent a shiver down Clara's spine. "I remember you," he said quietly. "You're the one who's been taking care of me." Clara nodded, her heart racing. "I've been here every day, Mr. Williams. I'm a nurse." "No," Harold interrupted, his voice low but insistent. "You're not just a nurse. You know what I did." The words hit her like a slap, and Clara felt her pulse quicken. She hadn't expected him to bring it up again, and yet, there it was. The question. The one that had been haunting her since the night he woke. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain calm. Harold's expression hardened. His eyes grew distant, and for a moment, Clara thought he might fall back into a coma-like state. But then, his lips parted, and he spoke in a voice that was barely audible, as though he was afraid someone might overhear him. "You have to understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I didn't want it to go this far, but I had no choice." Clara leaned in, trying to make sense of what he was saying. "What happened, Mr. Williams? What do you mean?" Harold swallowed hard, his throat working as if it was difficult to speak. His gaze flickered toward the door, as if checking to see if anyone else was listening. He seemed so fragile, so broken in that moment. It's not something I can talk about here," he said, his voice barely a breath. "But you have to know the truth. What I did wasn't just a mistake. It was planned. Every move. Every detail." Clara's mind was racing. What was he talking about? A mistake? A plan? She could barely keep up with the fragments of his words, let alone make sense of them. "Mr. Williams, please," Clara said, her voice pleading now. "You have to tell me. What are you talking about? What did you do?" For a long time, Harold didn't answer. His eyes stared into the distance, lost in memories that Clara couldn't access. He was somewhere else, trapped in a world of his own, and Clara felt as though she were intruding. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he spoke again, his words heavy with regret. "I was involved in something dangerous," he said, his voice shaking. "I got in too deep, and now there's no way out. That's why I ended up in that accident. That's why I've been in a coma." Clara felt a cold wave of fear wash over her. What was he talking about? What kind of dangerous situation had he gotten himself into? But before she could press him further, the door to the room opened, and Dr. Miller walked in, his eyes immediately going to Harold. "Mr. Williams," he said, his voice professional. "How are you feeling today?" Harold turned his head slowly, his gaze flickering over to the doctor. Clara watched him closely, noting how his expression shifted. He was suddenly guarded, his walls going back up. "I'm fine," Harold said quickly, his tone shutting down any further conversation. "I just need some rest." Dr. Miller didn't seem to notice the tension in the room. "Very well. We'll continue monitoring you. If you need anything, just let us know." With that, the doctor turned and left, leaving Clara and Harold alone again. The air between them felt thick with unspoken words, and Clara felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She wanted to ask him more. She needed to know more about the dangerous situation he had mentioned. But she also knew that Harold wasn't going to give up his secrets easily. Whatever he had been involved in, it was clear that he wasn't ready to open up about it yet. Clara sat down in the chair next to his bed, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Harold's story than he was letting on. She had to know the truth. She had to understand what had really happened. And somehow, deep down, Clara knew that this was only the beginning. Whatever Harold had been involved in, whatever secrets he was hiding, it would change everything. For both of them. Clara could feel it. The tension, the creeping sense of unease that clung to the hospital room. It wasn't just the sterile smell of disinfectant or the beeping machines that filled the air, it was something deeper, more unsettling. She could tell that Harold Williams, the millionaire who had awakened from his coma, was hiding something, a truth so dark that it had forced him into silence, even after weeks of being unconscious. The conversation from earlier replayed in her mind like an echo. "I was involved in something dangerous," Harold had said. "I got in too deep, and now there's no way out. That's why I ended up in that accident." The words haunted her, spinning in her thoughts. Dangerous? What had Harold gotten involved in? And why, in God's name, did he think she knew something? After the doctor left the room, Clara had stayed by Harold's side, unable to walk away. She needed answers. She had to understand the pieces of the puzzle that were scattered, half-formed, around her. The longer she sat there, the more questions grew in her mind. Who was Harold Williams? And what kind of life had he been leading before the coma? Had it all been some kind of mistake, or was he hiding something that went far beyond his accident? She had never felt so helpless, so uncertain. She had seen people at their lowest, in the darkest moments of their lives, but nothing had prepared her for this. There was an aura of danger around Harold that Clara couldn't shake, and now, with every word he spoke, it felt like the walls were closing in on her. That night, after her shift ended, Clara couldn't bring herself to leave the hospital. She knew she couldn't go back to her small apartment and forget about Harold Williams. She needed to know more. She needed to understand the full story, even if it meant digging into a past she might not be prepared to face. As Clara sat in the hospital break room, nursing a cup of coffee, she thought about her options. She could go to the police, but would they even listen? Or worse, would they be involved in whatever Harold had been tangled in? She could talk to the doctors, but that wouldn't get her any closer to the truth. The only person who held the answers was Harold himself, but he was still so guarded, so unwilling to open up. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out, expecting a message from her mother or a friend. But it wasn't either of those. It was a news alert. Millionaire business tycoon Harold Williams declared critical after car accident, family keeps silent. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. She clicked on the link, her eyes scanning the article quickly. There was little new information, just the usual headline, a mention of the car accident, and a vague reference to Harold's estranged relationship with his family. His wife hadn't been seen in public since the accident, and his children had refused to comment. The story had remained largely a mystery, until now. Clara's finger hovered over the phone screen. She needed more information. She had to know what had happened in the days leading up to the accident. She had to understand why Harold had become so distant, so terrified of his own past. The next morning, Clara arrived early for her shift, determined to get some answers. As she walked down the hallway toward Harold's room, she noticed a few nurses whispering in the corner, their eyes darting toward her as she passed. She had never been one to care about office gossip, but today, she couldn't ignore the feeling that something was off. Something had shifted, and she wasn't sure if it was her imagination or if the whole hospital knew something she didn't. When she reached Harold's room, she saw his eyes were closed again, his breathing steady. He looked fragile, like someone who had been through a storm and had barely survived. Clara didn't want to admit it, but she felt a strange mix of pity and curiosity toward him. She had spent hours with him over the past few days, and yet she still knew so little about who he really was. The millionaire persona, the business tycoon, was just a mask. Beneath that mask was a man broken by secrets. Clara stood by his bed, watching him for a moment, trying to figure out how to approach him this time. She couldn't just keep asking the same questions. She needed a different angle, a different approach. Harold's eyes opened slowly, and when they focused on her, Clara was struck by the intensity in them. He wasn't just awake, he was aware. And for the first time, it seemed like he was ready to talk. "Clara," Harold said, his voice hoarse. He cleared his throat, struggling to find the right words. "I know you've been trying to figure me out. You think you can help me, don't you?" Clara felt her pulse quicken. "I just want to understand what happened. You don't have to keep pretending like everything is fine." He didn't speak for a moment, his eyes flickering toward the window. He was calculating something in his mind, as if weighing whether or not to trust her with the truth. Finally, he spoke again. "You think I'm just some millionaire who got in over his head," Harold said, his voice low and almost bitter. "But it's more complicated than that. What I did, what I was involved in, it goes far beyond business deals and financial mistakes. I made enemies, Clara. And when you make enemies in my world, there's no coming back from it." Clara stepped closer, her heart racing. This was it. This was the moment ere the truth would finally come out. But even as Harold spoke, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still being held back. There was more to this than just bad business decisions or family drama. "What do you mean by enemies?" Clara asked, her voice steady but desperate for an answer. Harold's eyes flicked to hers, then away again. "I'll tell you. But you have to promise me something." Clara leaned forward, her breath catching in her throat. "Anything. You have to promise me you won't tell anyone. Not the doctors, not the police, no one. If you do, you'll put both our lives at risk." Clara nodded without hesitation. She didn't fully understand what he meant, but she trusted him, or at least, she wanted to. The urgency in his voice was enough to convince her. Something was coming, something big, and she had to know what it was. "I was involved in a company," Harold continued, his voice quiet but firm. "A company that dealt with more than just legitimate investments. We were involved in things that no one could know about. I thought I could control it, that I could keep it all under wraps. But I was wrong. Clara's mind raced. What kind of things? Drugs? Arms deals? What are you talking about? Harold hesitated, his fingers twitching slightly, as if the words were difficult to say. Everything. We were involved in some of the most dangerous business transactions you could imagine. Money laundering. Smuggling. All of it. And I was at the center of it. But it wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about power, control. Clara's stomach churned. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. The man she had been caring for, the man she had seen lying helpless in that bed for weeks, was a part of something much darker than she could have imagined. The millionaire businessman was nothing more than a pawn in a game that had spiraled out of control. I tried to get out, Harold whispered. But they wouldn't let me. They wouldn't let anyone leave once they were in. I should have known better. They came for me, Clara. They made sure I wouldn't talk. Clara felt her heart race. Is that why you were in the accident? Harold nodded, his eyes darkening. Yes. They staged it. They tried to kill me. But I survived. And now, I'm paying the price for it. Clara took a step back, her mind reeling. She couldn't even begin to comprehend what Harold was saying. How could someone like him, a powerful business tycoon, get caught up in something so dangerous, so illegal? And why had he kept it a secret for so long? Before she could ask another question, the door opened, and Dr. Miller walked in, his expression neutral. Harold immediately closed his eyes, his body going limp as if he were pretending to sleep. Clara's heart pounded. She had no idea what was coming next, but she knew one thing for certain: whatever secrets Harold was hiding, they were far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Clara's mind was spinning, each new piece of information about Harold Williams sending her in 100 different directions. The man who had once been a faceless millionaire in a coma, now had a story of danger. Secrets, and crimes that no one, not even the police, could have imagined. And now, Clara was tangled in it all. Her heart raced as she thought about what Harold had said, the things he had confessed. Harold wasn't just a businessman. He wasn't simply a victim of an accident. He was in deep. Too deep. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest. She had no idea who Harold really was anymore. One minute, he was a vulnerable man lying in a hospital bed, and the next, he was a man tangled in a web of crime, a man whose life might have been destroyed by the people he trusted. And then there was the question that hung in the air, unanswered: who had tried to kill him? Clara had heard enough in those few moments to know that this wasn't something she could walk away from. But how much danger was she in now? How much danger were they both in? The doctor had come in and Harold had instantly shut down. He was good at playing the game, pretending to sleep as if nothing was wrong. But Clara knew better. Harold wasn't just trying to keep his secrets, he was protecting her, too. She didn't know how or why, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the $1,000,000 smile he had once worn wasn't as innocent as it seemed. There was something more to him than met the eye, something far darker than his wealth. As Clara sat by his side once more, the weight of everything he had shared with her settled over her. She should have felt scared, perhaps even terrified. But there was something compelling about Harold's story that kept her anchored. The danger was real. She couldn't deny it. But somewhere deep inside, Clara felt a need to know more. She couldn't let this mystery go unsolved. That afternoon, after a brief break, Clara returned to Harold's room to find him awake, but he was more restless than usual. His hands fidgeted with the bed sheets, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Mr. Williams?" Clara called out softly, trying not to startle him. Harold's eyes snapped to hers, and for a moment, she saw the old man, the one who had been lying still, his life hanging in the balance. But that was before. Now, there was something else in those eyes, something sharp, focused, and full of secrets. He regarded her carefully before nodding his head. "Clara," he said quietly, his voice rough from disuse. "I need to tell you more. There's no way you can understand what's happening unless I give you the full story." Clara didn't hesitate. She walked to the side of his bed, her hands shaking slightly. "Tell me everything. I need to know." Harold took a deep breath, his hands trembling ever so slightly. He was on edge, she could tell. Something was weighing on him. Whatever he had been hiding, whatever force had pushed him to this point, was not over. It was only just beginning. "I told you about the company," he started, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "I wasn't just a businessman. Was a player in a much bigger game. There are people out there who control entire industries. It's not just about money, it's about power. The company I worked for was involved in laundering money for governments and organizations that you wouldn't believe. We were linked to some of the most powerful people in the world." Clara took in a slow breath, trying to keep her emotions in check. It sounded like something straight out of a thriller, but Harold's eyes weren't lying. He was speaking from experience. This wasn't a story. This was his reality. "You've been asking about the accident," Harold continued. "That wasn't an accident. It was a warning. They tried to kill me. They failed. But the message was clear. Stay quiet. Stay out of it. But I couldn't. I couldn't just walk away from what I knew. They weren't just after me, Clara. They were after everything I had. Everything I knew." Clara felt a lump form in her throat as his words sank in. She had been right to be suspicious. This wasn't just some petty business drama. This was bigger. Much bigger. "Who did this to you?" she whispered, her voice almost lost in the noise of the machines. Harold's face darkened, his lips curling into a grimace as he thought about the answer. His eyes, once clear and calculating, now seemed haunted by a past that he couldn't escape. "It was a group I used to work with. A private organization, no one knows about them. They operate in the shadows. Governments, private companies, even criminal syndicates. They have their hands in everything, from oil to weaponry. You won't find them in the press. You won't find them in the headlines. But they exist. And they've been watching me for years. Ever since I started asking too many questions." Clara couldn't believe what she was hearing. It sounded like something out of a spy novel, a conspiracy theory turned reality. But Harold was dead serious. The man she had been caring for, the man who had awakened from a coma, wasn't just a victim. He was part of a much larger, far more dangerous story. "Why did they go after you?" Clara asked, unable to contain her curiosity. "What did you do?" Harold looked down at his hands, the weight of the question clearly weighing on him. He hesitated before answering, as if the words themselves were a struggle. "I found something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I found evidence that linked them to illegal operations. I was ready to go public with it. But they found out. They caught wind of what I was planning. And they tried to stop me. It wasn't supposed to be like this. But now it is. I can't go back. And I can't let them silence me." Clara's head was spinning. She couldn't imagine what it must have been like for Harold, knowing that he was being hunted by powerful people with the resources to destroy him. But what had he uncovered? What kind of evidence could be so important that it led to an assassination attempt? Before she could ask another question, the door to the room opened, and a nurse entered with a tray of food. It was just the interruption Clara needed. The tension in the room had reached its breaking point, and she needed a moment to digest everything Harold had said. The nurse, oblivious to the gravity of the conversation, placed the tray on the table next to Harold's bed and turned to leave. But before she could exit, she paused and glanced back at Clara. "Mr. Williams has a visitor," she said, her voice tentative. "A man named Richard Caldwell. He's on his way up now." Clara's stomach dropped. The name hit her like a ton of bricks. Richard Caldwell. Harold's business partner. The man who had been with Harold for years. The man who had built their empire together. Clara turned back to Harold, her eyes wide. "What's he doing here? He's not supposed to be involved." Harold's face darkened, his body tense. "Caldwell," he muttered, almost under his breath. "He's the last person I wanted to see. He's part of the reason I'm in this mess." Before Clara could respond, the door swung open, and Richard Caldwell stepped into the room. His tall, broad frame filled the doorway, and his eyes locked on Harold's, cold and calculating. "Harold," Richard said, his voice smooth, but with an edge of tension underneath. "I see you're awake." Clara could feel the shift in the air. Harold stiffened, and his eyes narrowed. She had never seen him this guarded, this defensive. There was no longer any pretense of politeness. Whatever relationship they had once shared had been shattered, and now the two men seemed like enemies in the making. "Caldwell," Harold replied, his voice tight. "I didn't expect you to show up. What do you want?" Richard stepped into the room, his eyes flicking briefly to Clara before returning to Harold. "I came to check on you. I thought I might find out where we stand now. You and I, well, we have unfinished business." Clara stood there, frozen, watching the tension build between the two men. There was something off about Richard's demeanor. He wasn't here to visit. He wasn't here to offer comfort. He was here for something else. And Clara had a sinking feeling that she was about to find out just how deep this conspiracy really went. Clara could feel the weight of the silence between them, thick and suffocating, as Richard Caldwell stepped closer to Harold's bed. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, to get out of the room before things got more complicated than they already were, but she couldn't. She couldn't just walk away now. Not with everything on the line. Not with the mystery she had already plunged herself into. Richard didn't look like a man in a rush. He moved with the kind of slow, deliberate confidence that made people uneasy, like he knew something no one else did. His eyes, cold and calculating, darted briefly toward Clara, taking her in with a single glance. She wasn't sure if he recognized her, but he certainly hadn't missed her presence in the room. "Clara," he said, his voice smooth but clipped, as if she was a minor inconvenience in the grand scheme of things. "I didn't expect you to be here." Clara stiffened but kept her composure. "I'm just a nurse," she replied, her voice tight. "I'm here to take care of Mr. Williams." Richard's lips curled into a tight smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Of course. Well, I'm sure Mr. Williams can handle a nurse. But maybe we should talk." He turned to Harold, whose expression had turned to stone. The tension between the two men was palpable. Clara couldn't help but watch them closely. Harold had gone from being a vulnerable patient to a man with a dangerous secret. And now, Richard, his old business partner, was here, and something told Clara he wasn't here just to check on his health. Richard lowered himself into the chair beside Harold's bed, crossing his arms and settling in as though he had all the time in the world. He didn't say anything at first, his eyes flicking between Clara and Harold as if studying the dynamic between them. Clara's stomach churned with unease. "You've been a hard man to reach, Harold," Richard said finally, breaking the silence. "I didn't expect you to wake up so soon. You should have stayed unconscious a little longer. There are things we need to discuss." Harold's eyes narrowed. "If you think I'm going to make things easy for you, you're mistaken, Caldwell. You've already done enough." Clara glanced at Harold, her heart pounding. She could feel the tension building between them. There was something more to this conversation, something much darker than simple business dealings. It felt like two old friends who had once been on the same side, now standing on opposite ends of a battlefield. Enough? Richard's voice was low and almost amused. You don't get to decide what's enough, Harold. Not anymore. Clara's mind raced as she processed the words. What had they done together? What was the relationship between these two men really like? The situation was spiraling out of control, and Clara had no idea how deep the rabbit hole went. I never wanted any of this, Harold said, his voice growing more strained. You're the one who dragged me into it. Into all of this mess. And now it's too late. I can't run anymore. Richard's gaze softened, but it was a cold softness. You didn't want it, but you took it. You played the game, Harold. You were a player in their world, not some innocent bystander. Clara watched as the words sunk in. Harold had been part of something much bigger than she had ever imagined. They were talking about a world of power, money, and corruption, a world that Clara had no access to before. She had thought of Harold as just a businessman, a wealthy man who had somehow found himself in a coma. But now, she realized, he was much more than that. He had been a key player in a world of shadows, hidden from the public, from the authorities. But why had he been targeted? And more importantly, why was Richard here now? Before Clara could ask any of the questions swirling in her mind, Richard spoke again, his voice smoother now, as if he were trying to appeal to Harold's sense of reason. You've been a thorn in my side, Harold, Richard continued. But I don't want to see you destroyed. Not yet, anyway. We have unfinished business. You and I both know that. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. There was something off about Richard's tone. It was too calm, too controlled. He wasn't speaking like someone who cared about Harold's well-being. He was speaking like someone who had already made up his mind about Harold's future. Harold's eyes flickered with something between anger and fear. Unfinished business? Is that what you call it, Caldwell? After everything you did to me? Richard leaned forward slightly, his face now inches away from Harold's. After everything you did, Harold. You're the one who made the decision to dig deeper, to go after something bigger than you could handle. You didn't think the consequences would come back to bite you, did you? Clara felt a wave of confusion and dread wash over her. What were they talking about? What had Harold discovered that could make Richard speak with such cold contempt? I didn't want to uncover what I did, Harold said quietly, his voice hoarse. But it was too late by the time I realized what was going on. I couldn't walk away, Caldwell. You know I couldn't. Richard's lips twitched into something that barely resembled a smile. No, you couldn't. And now here we are, Harold. You, a broken man, and me, well, let's just say I'm on top. I've won. Clara's eyes widened. What did he mean by that? What had Richard done to Harold? I'm not finished yet, Harold said, the determination in his voice returning, though it was faint. You might think you've won, but you're wrong. There's more to this than you realize. Richard's eyes flashed, and he shot Harold a cold look. Is there? I don't think so, Harold. You're weak. You've lost. And there's nothing you can do about it now. Clara's heart skipped a beat as she watched their interaction unfold. She had always assumed that Harold was the one in control. After all, he had the power, the wealth, the status. But now, it seemed like Richard was the one pulling the strings, the one with the upper hand. But something didn't add up. Harold had been involved in something big, something dangerous, and now Richard was acting like he had the power. What if they were both part of something even bigger, something that was going to change everything for them both? Before Clara could process any more of their conversation, Harold suddenly reached out, grabbing Richard's arm with surprising force. I'm not finished, Harold repeated, his voice low and filled with resolve. Not by a long shot. Richard yanked his arm back, his eyes narrowing. You're out of your league, Harold. You should have stayed quiet. You should have stayed out of it. Clara could see the fire in Harold's eyes. He was no longer the broken man she had cared for. He was fighting back, and in that moment, Clara realized something: Harold wasn't just a victim. He had been a part of something far darker, and he wasn't going down without a fight. Richard's gaze shifted to Clara once more, his eyes cold and calculating. I hope you understand what you're involved in now, Clara. You're in over your head. You should leave. Now. Clara stood still, her body trembling slightly from the tension in the room. She couldn't leave now. Not after everything she had seen. Not after everything Harold had told her. She wasn't going anywhere. I'm not going anywhere, she said firmly, her voice steady despite the fear gripping her. I'm staying right here, and I'm going to help Harold. Whatever it takes. Richard's lips curled into that same cold smile. Fine. But don't say I didn't warn you. And with that, Richard stood up, his eyes lingering on Harold one last time before he walked toward the door. Clara's heart raced as she watched him leave. The danger was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. The web of lies, betrayal, and power was tightening around them, and Clara knew that the worst was yet to come. Clara stood by Harold's bed, her mind racing with the events that had unfolded in the past few days. The weight of Richard Caldwell's words hung over her like a thick fog. She had always known that there was more to Harold's coma than just an accident. But now, with Richard's cryptic warnings and the dark tension in the room, Clara knew that she had only scratched the surface of a much larger mystery. Harold's gaze was distant, his face pale and drawn as he lay there, still recovering from the coma. But his eyes, despite the physical weakness, had a glint of something powerful. There was a depth there, one that Clara hadn't fully understood until now. He was hiding something. And she was determined to find out what it was. Harold, Clara said, her voice soft but firm, I need to know everything. What happened? What's going on between you and Richard? Harold's eyes flickered toward her, the faintest of smiles pulling at the corners of his lips. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was more like a resigned one, as if he had expected this moment to come, but didn't want it to. You don't know what you're getting into, Clara, Harold replied in a hoarse whisper. You really don't. Clara's frustration flared. She wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not after everything she had learned, and everything that was still left unknown. I've been here with you through everything. I'm already involved. And I deserve to know the truth. For a long moment, Harold didn't speak. His silence was almost oppressive. Clara could feel the weight of the mystery pressing in on her, almost suffocating her. She didn't know if he was protecting her or trying to keep her from the truth. But she had a sinking feeling that whatever he was hiding was much worse than she could have ever imagined. Finally, Harold exhaled slowly, his eyes closing for a brief moment as though gathering the strength to speak. It started years ago, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard and I, we were partners in a business venture. A very lucrative one. At first, it was all about making money, building empires. But then things changed. People started to get hurt. The stakes were raised, and we were no longer just businessmen. We became part of something much bigger, something dangerous. Clara leaned in closer, hanging on every word. What kind of danger? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. What did you get involved in? Harold's eyes flickered to hers, and for a moment, she saw a flash of vulnerability. It was about power, he said slowly. And control. We were involved with people who didn't play by the rules. People who would do anything to maintain their grip on power. And we made a mistake. We tried to walk away. We thought we could leave it behind. Clara's stomach churned. But you couldn't, she said quietly, the realization sinking in. No, Harold said, his voice tightening. We couldn't. Because they wouldn't let us. The room seemed to grow colder as Harold's words hung in the air. Clara's mind was racing. She could barely process the gravity of what he was telling her. Richard Caldwell wasn't just a businessman. He was part of something much darker. Something that went beyond money, beyond power. This was about control. And the people behind it, whoever they were, had no intention of letting Harold or Richard go. Who are they, Harold? Clara asked, her voice shaking. Who are these people you were involved with? Harold's eyes flickered to the door, his gaze wary. He lowered his voice even further. I don't know their names. Not all of them. But they've been pulling strings for years. They control everything, the government, the media, the financial world. They're the ones who control what happens in the shadows, where no one can see. And we, Richard and I, we were just pawns in their game. Clara felt her pulse quicken as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. So, it wasn't just about the money. You were both part of a conspiracy. Harold nodded slowly, his face grim. Yes. And when we tried to get out, they came after us. They didn't want any loose ends. That's why Richard set me up. That's why he pushed me into that coma. Clara's breath caught in her throat. He did this to you? Richard? The betrayal was almost too much to process. Harold nodded again, his expression one of bitter resignation. He knew I was getting too close. Too many questions, too many people asking the wrong things. He had to make sure I was out of the picture. And the coma, it was the perfect cover. But why keep you alive? Clara asked, her mind spinning. Why not just finish the job? That's what I don't understand, Harold said, his voice thick with frustration. I thought they were going to kill me. But they didn't. They left me in that coma for years. And when I woke up, I was a threat. A liability. Clara could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her. She could see the fear in his eyes, but also the determination. He had been in the center of a web of corruption and deceit, and now he was trying to escape it, trying to bring the truth to light. You have to go to the authorities, Clara said, her voice urgent. You have to tell someone. You have the power to stop them. Harold shook his head slowly. It's not that simple. They've covered their tracks too well. They control everything. They'll find a way to silence me again. Clara felt her stomach twist. This was bigger than she had ever imagined. She had known that Harold was hiding something, but now she realized how deep this went. Richard Caldwell wasn't just a businessman. He was part of a much larger conspiracy, one that spanned governments, corporations, and criminal organizations. They can't control everything, Clara said, more to herself than to Harold. You have the truth. The truth will set you free. Harold's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, Clara saw a flicker of hope in his eyes. Maybe, he said quietly. But what if the truth isn't enough? What if they'll stop at nothing to make sure no one finds out? Clara took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Then we'll make sure the world knows. Just then, there was a soft knock on the door. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know who it was, but she had a sinking feeling it wasn't good. Before she could react, the door creaked open, and in walked a figure she didn't recognize, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark suit, his face hidden behind dark sunglasses. Harold's expression hardened in an instant. I thought I told you to stay away, he growled, his voice a low snarl. The man didn't respond at first, but his presence was intimidating enough to silence any further protests. He stepped forward, his eyes cold and unwavering. I'm afraid it's too late for that, Mr. Williams, he said, his voice deep and gravelly. Clara stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Who was this man? And why did he sound like he had the authority to end it all? You've been a problem, Harold, the man continued, his eyes narrowing slightly. And we don't tolerate problems. Harold's jaw clenched. You think you can intimidate me? You think you can make me back down? The man didn't flinch. It's not about intimidation. It's about control. And with that, everything Clara thought she understood about the situation shattered. The truth was out there, yes. But the people who controlled it were not going to let go so easily. Harold wasn't the only one at risk. Now, it was Clara's life on the line too.